For many people in the civil liberties community, the erosion of free speech has been alarming. And that erosion most notably has occurred in Western nations that have always viewed free speech as the touchstone of their democratic traditions. The United States has always been a bulwark against that, but we have also seen erosion in this country as well. I'm going to go through a number of aspects of this issue. I'm going to focus on a comparison between the United States and Great Britain. Free speech in Europe is really on life support. They have, for decades, had laws that curtailed free speech that was deemed not just hateful, but intimidating, insulting, degrading. In France, you are barred from using language that is deemed incitement or is a type of racial discrimination, hatred, violence, advocacy, dealing with race, origin, ethnic group, religion, national identity. It also covers private communications, which is different from the United States. In Netherlands, you are barred from public insults, any words inciting hatred on race, religion, sexual orientation, or personal convictions. In the United Kingdom, there are criminal laws barring language that are deemed threatening, abusive, insulting, or likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress. I'll repeat that, are likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress. And in those standards, you can see this very significant difference in the United States, where language like that, ambiguous language of that kind, would have a very hard time passing muster in the United States. In Ireland, you not only have criminalized offensive speech, you also actually have an outright blasphemy law. So in Ireland, you actually can be prosecuted for insulting religion. The comparison between the United States and Great Britain has always been a particular interest of me. You know, famously, we were supposedly two nations divided by a common language. But it's far more than that. The English were actually quite slow to recognize free speech protections, and is notably not guaranteed in Magna Carta. In 2015, I had the honor of speaking at the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, I think by a host that didn't realize that I had spent my academic career criticizing Magna Carta. And so I went and pointed out the fact that as a legal document protecting civil liberties, it was actually rather frightening, putting aside the fact that it was instantly ignored by every sovereign that had anything to do with it. But what was interesting about the Magna Carta, and I used when I got there, the English really lectured me repeatedly that you should not say the Magna Carta, you should say Magna Carta. But that was just one great leap over the pond I couldn't make. But what's interesting is that the Magna Carta did not include free speech protections and enforced basically a series of civil limitations on free speech under sedition. So England never had a formal constitutional protection of free speech. And that's very interesting when you consider what the framers did. Because it's not, often people treat the U.S. Constitution as a one-off from Magna Carta and the English traditions. In fact, the one area where we were very clearly different was on issues of free speech, and that became more pronounced with time. The rights were largely in England, statutory rights protecting free speech, and a tradition. And so the English have a long tradition, of course, of sort of a benign government without many formal guarantees. So you were, in fact, subject to a reserved right for prosecution for your speech in England. It's just that they, fortunately, did not use it that much. And you really get the idea of the tradition in Great Britain from Justice Holt. Chief Justice John Holt said that it was absurd that speakers and writers should not be called to account for possessing the people with an ill opinion of the government. No government can subsist under that type of system. that really sort of captures the idea of a passive, benign, but otherwise empowered government in dealing with speech issues. So today, Great Britain is in many ways ground zero for those of us in the free speech community. It led the way in the expansion of the criminalization of speech. It's a close race with Germany and France. Germany had, as we're going to see, many limitations, particularly after World War II. But to give you an example of the type of issues they're dealing with in England, and Barry Thu was arrested for an anti-police t-shirt that simply read, "Kill a cop for fun," and "One less pig-perfect justice." Home Secretary Amber Rudd was accused of a hate crime for saying that foreign workers were taking jobs from British citizens. Neil Phillips was investigated for telling a Nelson Mandela joke in an online chat. A former soldier was prosecuted and convicted for burning a Koran. A Baptist preacher was jailed for calling homosexuality a sin. A teenager was charged with a hate crime and this was later dropped, but it was initially charged for holding up a sign reading, "Scientology is not a religion, it is a dangerous cult." France has seen the same type of prosecutions. Famously, Brigitte Bardot, the actress, was convicted of writing a letter to the Interior Ministry at the time, by the way, who was Sarkozy at the time before he became the head of government. And she wrote him a letter criticizing Muslims and homosexuals, for which she was convicted for hate speech to write to the government. Designer John Galliano was prosecuted for using anti-Semitic language in a cafe. Even student groups like the Union of Jewish Students sued Twitter successfully for not disclosing the sources of anti-Semitic comments on Twitter. What was really striking for those of us in the free speech community was after the massacre at the Charlie Hebdo headquarters in January 2015, there was a huge march by the world's leaders supporting free speech. Virtually every leader in that march had been denounced by the free speech community for their prosecution of free speech. The French leaders had led demands for the prosecution of this very magazine. And they gathered around this famous statue, which was a guarantee of the French people that they would forever be protecting liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was such a striking contrast that one of the surviving editors of the magazine refused to appear and said he wanted to throw up by the very sight of it. Because France has, with England, aggressively rolled back on free speech. There is no exception for political speech in many of these countries. In France, you have a mayor convicted because he complained that immigrant children were increasing in number in public schools and causing great stress on the budget. Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is, of course, a nationalist, very controversial figure, was convicted of offensive speech for calling Roma smelly, and he was later convicted for belittling Nazi war crimes. 12 protesters were convicted because they supported the boycott of Israel. Now, none of these things are any comments that most of us want to be associated with, but it does show you the sharp contrast between how free speech is handled today in Europe and how it is handled in the United States. Germany, as I mentioned, led the rollback on free speech in a different way after World War II, and it is quite understandable. After World War II, they banned any symbol of the Nazi cause. And many of us have long been critical of those laws, not because we are critical of the motivation. But first of all, those laws have never worked in history. It's never worked to ban speech. All it does is force speech underground. It makes these people into heroes. And so they become victims. It hasn't made any difference to the neo-Nazi movement in Germany, which is flourishing. All they did is they changed the swastika to a slightly different symbol. They changed the Nazi salute to a slightly different salute. but they were able to claim that they're now victims and that the government doesn't want to hear what they have to say. It's much better. In the free speech community, certainly this is the view, but it's much better, I think, historically, to have these people speak openly, to know who they are, to let good speech respond to bad speech. But in Germany, they continue down this road, and it's led to absolutely bizarre and rather silly cases. There was a German man convicted because he had a ringtone on his phone, which was a Hitler speech. A British bishop was charged for questioning the Holocaust. A dog owner was convicted because he trained a dog to give a Nazi salute when he said Heil Hitler. This was a comedian who did it. He thought it would be a funny joke with his roommate. German pub owners were convicted of selling 4 bottles of a wine called the Führer wine. And a German politician was convicted of calling refugees scum. The rest of the West, it's not much better. The Dutch have repeatedly convicted one of their nationalist, most controversial leaders of hate speech. Poland has criminalized statements suggesting Polish collusion in war crimes in World War II. Ireland investigated Stephen Fry for sharing his views on God under the blasphemy law. Soccer player Gig Buffon was investigated for saying Dio, or God, after a play in Italy as a form of blasphemy. An Italian bar faced its own charges for selling the Mein Kampf wine. Even comedians have been prosecuted throughout Europe for making jokes that were viewed as anti-Semitic or hateful. And this includes Canada, which has had a serious rollback in free speech. In Canada, you had a stand-up comedian at a nightclub who got into a trash-talking exchange with a table of lesbians at a nightclub, referred to them as in their status as lesbians, and he was convicted. In Spain, puppeteers were arrested for a skit showing the stabbing of a police officer. So you get an idea how there really is no limitation now to the criminalization of speech that is viewed as offensive. Now, you look at the United States and you can see why in the United States we have had such a different approach to free speech. In many respects, the American Revolution was a triumph of free speech. It was a triumph of people who were incredibly annoying, quite frankly. Thomas Paine was positively one of the most annoying historical figures in history. And that's saying a lot when you're living at the same time as John Adams. And, you know, Paine, John Adams actually, of all people, called John Adams a crapulous mass. Which is really, it's a shame that phrase has gone out of circulation. It's so much better than most of the things you can say about people. And the fact is, this crapulous mass helped write many of the most core sort of visionary concepts of free speech. He was himself an example of free speech and the need for its protection. And so in the United States, we clearly stated free speech as a right, not as a privilege, and guaranteed it in the First Amendment. Justice Brandeis said so clearly that this was a means indispensable to discovery and spread of political truth. Hugo Black said famously, "I take no law abridging to mean no law abridging," which is hands down my favorite quote of any justice in history.